psychotic. Approaching to do away with unconsciousness seems challenging, daunting even, but at least a little bit more manageable. An adamant individual set out to structure strength of character had set out to be up in the middle of the night just to keep watch. The goal was for the determined devotee to fight off fantasies, concoctions, invisibilities, appearances, machinations, speculations, thoughts, feelings, sentiments, pretensions, inventions, reveries, and so on that did not align with the Christian ethos. To keep the forces which pulled the committed away from the Christian path, the devoted had to maintain their vision receptive to Nyx for the sole purpose of learning familiarity with spirits so as to be able to know how to distinguish one from the other. Maintaining a garden requires upkeep, particularly of the discernible kind. Undoubtedly, this is a discriminatory practice. We mentioned the word arousal with regards to moving soul. For some, this may imply sexual connotations. In this instance, we're using the word more closely associated to cause, induce, prompt, inspire, evoke, kindle, and or foster. But of what exactly, though? Of an acuity for the invisible, to whatever bothers us or gets in the way of our sleep. These visitors, which come along to bother resting cycles, have us endure experiences of a different nature from the reconfigurations of reminiscent yearnings we partake in during daytime. The supernatural essences contained within what we call worry, self-admonishment, neuroticism, remorse, penitence, contrition, phobia, erotic cravings were all referred to with similar like context in the old world. In modern terminology, these children and posterity of the mythological figure Nyx have been compartmentalized into intricate psychological puzzles. In the old world, one could have a conversation with Moros, Momos, Canis, Nemesis, Irenaeus, Oasis, and Cupris, so as to be able to grab a better sense for what was considered to be inevitable happenings, to begin to come to know who were the guilt bringers, the penalizers, the venge-filled, furious victimizers, the wretched afflicted, and where one's psychosexual fantasies lay. Biblical scripture refers to Nyx as Lilith, whom goes about in the night along with her company. As per usual, what would anything be without polarity? Night had a gleeful purpose. She calmed and provided rest for the exhausted. Her wingspan offered shelter to the resting world. For some strange reason, in our aging years, we seem to think about the protection she offers less and tend to think about the nightmare company she brings along with her, which seems to force us to wake up. Whether we regard these configurations of night to be psychological, compartmentalized puzzles or complexes being awoken from our slumber to confront, these configurations expand the boundaries of our character. We begin to familiarize ourselves with what doesn't have entry inside of the realm of day, with what is being failed to be integrated. Interestingly enough, machinations which happen to us while in sleep states, mythically speaking, also belong to Nyx. These dreams or hallucinations that occur to us while asleep aren't enough to integrate the darkness of our consciousness with our conscious awareness. Sigmund Freud has said that dreams were designed to shield our sleep. For the most part, these machinations which occur to us while asleep do afford us the ability to rest peaceably. What they do well is disguise our worst phobias in imagistic codifications, permitting the anxiety therein to not interrupt our resting periods. The keeping on with dreaming without dragging us out of slumber appears to be not what the aging body desires. Not only do the urinary sacs, which retain our urine for excretion, cause us to wake up in the middle of the night, but so do shifts in our circadian rhythms. As we grow older, physiologically speaking, the patterns we inhabit with respect to our urinary system change, although we may still produce the same amount of urine as younger men. When we're older, we'll likely end up secreting more successfully during the night. We take this to mean that what patterns we establish to find alleviation alter the more we head into our psychological years. The rhythms we grew accustomed to are disrupted by the necessity to integrate alternate methods of release. Release from the psychological equivalents of salt and water that our psychological bodies withhold. We may have little control, if any at all, of controlling these naturally occurring changes within both our physical bodies and psychological bodies, but we may be better adaptives if we consider ourselves to be better at integrating these changes. There are, after all, better things we can do about visioning the sequences that come with our internal senses, especially the senses that come along with an aged character. We are being, perhaps more precisely, being itself is being led to pick up a new tempo. These internal senses, which aid physiological and psychological alleviation of excesses, draw us and place us in the darkness as well as around it. It happens in incremental phases to our consciousness, it in this instance being clarity. One moment we are dreaming, protected from phobias, and the next we are realizing clearly we must alleviate ourselves. The aging character requires more clarity and less sleep. Aspirations of what's been spoken, our impermanence, distress, fault finding, retaliations, and lust supposedly don't permit us to be at ease in aged filled years? How come? Do we lack the clarity necessary to permit us to get the upper hand on our demanded of necessary discriminatory practices? Is the man in peace not the one who's successfully managed to isolate what he does and does not have to devote to? Is he not the one who's figured what invisibility to lodge and be lodged with? In such a process, we are awoken due to the vicissitude of the onslaught of attacks coming from the offspring of Nyx. Sustaining attention to the onslaught should trigger a response within us as to whether or not there is justification for the attacks. The task is not simple. The labor is one to bear. It's no wonder why failure to integrate is normal. It's even more difficult to learn how to properly integrate these psychological dynamics when guilt is weaponized against us. The persecution coming from perpetrators weaponizing guilt could come out to be hostile. Harboring sentiments of reproach toward Nyx certainly won't lead us to better integration. What if we imagined her as someone who wanted us to get to know her? Maybe she's distraught at how much of her domain has been intoxicated with synthetic luminescences. Maybe she feels encroached upon by all the noise permeating the stillness she's supposed to bring. Night used to be a place which commonly held the ability to be able to have our breath taken away with a simple gaze toward the beyond that was just above us. We've stripped ourselves off of that privilege. Waking to the night envelops us to envelop a particular kind of intelligence. It seems not to give us choice. What else are we to do in the middle of the night besides review? Perhaps discovering the subtleties in thought are more prevalent while in night. Maybe that's why she insists on us wakening. A bit odd to say, especially because rest makes us feel renewed, refreshed, even whole. But do we not receive a similar type of feeling when we obtain a new outlook based on an insight gained from deepening ourselves in the abysmal of our imaginations? If we are to overcome restlessness, sustaining onslaughts from the machinations of night are but one proponent. Learning to delve into the black holes of our imaginations is a trait that we can proceed in. Night is often thought of to be associated with uncertainty. It's because of this uncertainty that panic likely ensues. Without getting too into technicals of what our bodies and brains produce when fear kicks in, it's more significant to mention the purpose behind episodic moments of prevalent fear. Often, they are moments of passage designed to grant one the status of elder. A fear designed to place someone under is intended to seize a whole sense of what it's like to be in peril. The moments, sentiments, essences therein are intended to be pivotal moments, sentiments, and essences one is to know for the commencing phases of one's life. Knowing one's fears is one thing, voluntarily exposing oneself to those fears is a whole other thing. Night, Nyx, her children, Moros, Momos, Keres, Nemesis, Irenas, Oises, Cupras, and their contemporary psychological compartmentalized counterparts, worry, self admonishment, neuroticism, remorse, penitence, contrition, phobia, erotic cravings, and so on, lead us to larger psychological beings of apparitions of what's been spoken of, impermanences, distress, fault findings, retaliations, and lust when unchecked. We possess the ability to voluntarily endure the onslaughts of fear stricken states uncertainty produces because of that which is cloaked by night's cover. Symbolically, what uncertainties are being cloaked by night's cover, thus permitting inattention to enable them further. Voluntarily, or rather, voluntary self exposure could very well begin within the confines of an 8.5 by 11-inch journal long entry. If we but have the smallest amounts of courage to go into the darkness of our mind to write what we experience. We suppose the question is, can we develop courage? It depends on our ability to imagine personified figures. Can we personify what contemporary psychology has called worry, self-admonishment, neuroticism, remorse, penitence, contrition, phobia, sexual cravings? Can we imagine them to be portions of ourselves? Can we imagine them to be in need of care, attendance, devotion, and attention, just like the rest of us? Can we stand to be around these factions of ourselves long enough to gain their trust so they can be themselves? Not so much to try and control or even change or win them over or capitulate to them, but to see if we can outlast them. Not so much as to try and dominate them or prove superior or prove inferior, but instead to see if they are able to be anything other than what contemporary psychology has said them out to be. Who knows? Maybe they are capable of doing so. Did that happen yesterday, or did that happen 3 days ago? What we had to do in the morning gets confused with what we had to do at night. Sometimes we care, other instances it all becomes one and the same. Where we once were, where we need to be in the next couple of hours, the places we've never been to somehow find their way of getting intertwined in our vernacular. We find ourselves, even if unknowingly, in a sorceress-like place where what possibilities and probabilities could have occurred and what actually occurred have lost their capacity to be distinguished, we don't know, some millennia ago. In this psychic state, what even is time? A place of being where logical conclusions, along with predictable outcomes and events, are the most unlikely circumstances to occur. Orders in our life events lose their grip on the sequence in which they happened. Clauses stack, one on top of the other, on top of a few several dozen others. Direction loses meaning, even importance or significance. Somehow we recognize it's one and the same. Sentences we utter become fractionated due to the bridges bridging them not having been able to be remembered. At times, some of us grow petulant, thinking that will be the way to recall what we desired to share. The train of thought, where is it? It was just there, in our mind, on our mind. It's gone, drifting away. There was a point. Where was it? So we move, thinking and believing that that's what we need to do to gain it back. Action, 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 indicative of our mind traveling when it's not supposed to, where it wasn't supposed to, subconsciously, faintly recognizing we were to stay put. Trouble is set to bloom just around the corner, so we become attuned to the peripherals of our vision. However, what's a little novelty without any sense of exploration, without a little risk for excitement? This is where the mishaps are probable in their likelihood if we but forget the sense of alertness. To what exactly, though? For starters, how about the fact that whether we like it or not, agree with it or not, we are meant to suffer in the existence of our fleshly mortality, despite all our efforts to be godly, despite our best, despite the best amongst us, exuding those qualities of godliness to perfection. Undoubtedly, our wishes to remember what subject matter was just at our forefront, and our inability to do so, for whatever reason, shame some of us. At times, we grow embarrassed by these occurrences, leaving us to deal with the suffering it's caused. This is not a bad thing if we can remember it can be used as a precursor to shattering egos. Falls occur to our overwhelming sense of ego superiority, which leads us to think we are incapable of coming up short, despite our pretense of what our sense constitutes our idea of might. So, how could we articulate? Where would we begin to articulate that? Being still loops us further into the muck and the mire responsible for our slight irritations. Somehow, the names of our relatives get placed on them incorrectly by our efforts. Passerbys begin to share details with whom we used to know, and we think, how could that person look a lot like so and so? We keep an idea of someone worthwhile in our mind. By some remarkable feature, we're capable of keeping them just as they were, unfazed by time. They've remained suspended outside of it, it would seem. Soon, the blend of characteristical traits that marks the dearest unto us begins to take precedence, without us even knowing how or why even. What in the world is going on? Why are we incapable of distinguishing individuating markers? We begin to wonder. The unclear waters in our memory, our aging memory, represent the fissure in the need to distinguish differentiating markers, or at bare minimum in the need to apply the effort to distinguish differentiating markers. Another necessity is taking its place, allocating itself unequivocally into our being by mode of our character. There's very little we can do about this assimilation of characteristics. Why not go back to what makes us human? To what the basic fundamentals and the essential elementals are of yes, or rather, Why not go back to what makes us human? To the basic, fundamental, essential elementals of, yes, none other than human consciousness. Let's not fuddle with the basic underlying context within the most humane of stories. Such a thing has proven to jeopardize even the most recluded amongst the dwellers of the ivory towers. The essence most of us share that takes immediacy as soon as we come into contact is what properties are contained within our human consciousness. Most of us, if not overwhelmingly, a large majority of us, were endowed with this gift. Maybe we didn't have to do much for it, but nonetheless, we carry the capacity to recognize that we exist. We also contain the capacity to recognize that that's not a trivial thing to recognize, no matter when such a recognition is made. So who the hell is who? What the hell is what? When the hell did such and such take place? And where exactly did it all take place? Who gives two shits? Seriously. There's something far more relevant to an overwhelmingly large majority of us. If we can manage to keep cool and chill out, we're sure we'll get to the bottom of it, of this prevalent relevance we all have in common. Where exactly could that take us? Only God knows. Not to deviate, but here's a little deviation. The other day, sometime not too long ago, an interesting thought occurred to us. It went something like, if artificial intelligence is going to be the end of humanity as we know it, it might as well be while the seed of mankind is circumnavigating the farthest regions of intergalactic space. Oddly enough, a burst of uncontrollable laughter came over us. Wisdom, O Lord, please, we beg of thee, what will we all look like when we are all drawn back to you? Will we be able to face even you, Almighty? We imagine it would be both something like a beautifully terrifying and terrifyingly beautiful set of occasions. Surely this mustn't be an absurd thing. We are your inheritors, after all. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. Overlapping, intersecting, coinciding, and overlaying sides to something multiplexuous, details to what bears meaning in our existence, finding ways to supersede past the bullshit. Only the most important attributes of human consciousness worth mentioning, those worth stressing again and again. Engaging ourselves in this process reiterates common characteristics that we all share. The emphasis of our attention becomes our shared humanity. Sometime not too long ago, on an early Sunday, or rather Saturday afternoon, an unusual group of individuals were gathered in protest. There was a visible presence and diversity of ethnicity. There were Hispanics, Chinese, Sudanese, Middle Eastern members of this group were also present. What exactly were they protesting? Freedom for a specific country. The first thing that popped in mind while recognizing their presence was amazing. People gathered to express their thoughts, feelings, sentiments, emotions, ideas, and so on. Undoubtedly, the protest proved to be political. One of the members of the group, a migrant from Sudan, was posed a question. Do you consider yourself an American? He responded by saying no. It was fascinating. Without him so much as even realizing it, he was engaged in the most Americana thing one could do. When common characteristics supersede individual variety, common ground can be found if the desire to find common ground is there. Murking up waters in our commonalities usually comes from individuals wanting us to focus on specific individual traits. We busy ourselves much of our aging years in applying effort to mark out what makes someone or something different from everything else. There once were. Who knows if there still are today, with progressive religion flooding mainstream. Saints who would discriminatory saints who held discriminatory practices as a worthwhile goodness to hold. As for an example, to use our capacity to single out, there is effort that is required to separate out what our beliefs, what our own beliefs are, and what are the beliefs a collective wants us to adopt. Parents often stress the significance of being able to tell a 1 from a 2, a 2 from a 3 from blue, pink from white, yellow from red, and so on to their children. They bring into our way of thinking the importance of applying the effort necessary to tell matter apart from other matter. Concerns grow. Parents may be led to think that their children are retarded if their children don't catch on to distinguishing quickly enough. The escape from the energy necessary to apply these discriminatory practices could very well be a huge protection against aging. Or rather, the escape from the energy necessary to apply these discriminatory practices could very well be a huge protection aging affords us, granting us an outcast kind of perspicacity. We don't break into this perspicacity, this sagaciousness, without some slight turbulence. With conceit, we try to recall, at times even with foolish pride, all to end in futility what we've tried to recall. First, the murkiness, then the turbulence presumes. We feel incapable, useless, like we are to befall and bemoan someone because of our inability to call forth what we need to call forth when we need to call it forth. The ancestorial spirit is commencing to assume a dominant position in our lives. We are sensing the world less through personal experience and more through permanent essential features. What used to entice us to blow out short fuses no longer have the same effects. Instead, we become acutely attuned to impediments regarding blockages, delaying our species' attempts to fulfill its destiny. We wanted to talk today about AI. Or rather, let's back up a little bit. We wanted to talk to you today about control. We can't talk about control unless we talk about thought control. We can't talk about thought control unless we talk about mind control, which is a term overplayed and under-articulated. We can't talk to you about mind control without bringing to our forefront some of the subtle implications towards aspects of soul, those attempting to control it or subdue it through force or by trying to bottle it, like as for an example within AI. If we are to bring to our forefronts control, like we just have, we always have to bring into question those who are engaged in either A, attempting to control what we hear, or B, those who are desirous to attempt to control what we hear. Nothing permeates in our lives unless we first come to hear about it. Through us, God speaks, but he also hears. We can scarcely begin to control what sort of output we are amongst in. What output gets put out by others, the spirit that is imbued by others' output, but we do possess the ability to consider what we prioritize. It's these kinds of stories, in fact, it's stories themselves that unfold the codes within us we wish to come to know. If we were human, if we were to categorize ourselves as humans, if we were to come to a starting point by and which our conceptual frame of reference for what it means to be human were to be within a close affinity for one another, we would begin to germinate appreciation for our humanity synchronistically. If we were to value such a foreground, we could begin to question what would be the most noteworthy of stories, those worthy of obtaining a perception for. No doubt it would be the stories of our essence, of our very humanity and its inevitable destiny. Controlling such narratives, controlling the nature of such narratives, has always been a lucrative business for those who despise humanity, which is why, for those of us who don't have such sentiments, preserving our ability to tell preserving our ability to tell such stories to one another must become an even more lucrative experience to be gained. We already possess interdimensional space travel. We possess it through the gateways of our minds. Our minds are the jet engines honing us where we wish to go. Spirit is the fuel. You should feel an enlivening effect as you hear these messages. Such a phenomenon, if we are connected, is no accident. That is a desired result. It's no biggie if it doesn't or hasn't happened. The encouragement here is to find what steers us. Due to the nature of our consciousness, we are all under some form or some kind of mind control or thought control. Although thought control and mind control are played with CIA exposed nefarious intentions, not all of us are subjugated to such horrible experiments, given that our consciousness can't help but automatically respond to the stimuli which surrounds us by linking associations with one thing in our mind to another. We have to ask ourselves how. How do we free ourselves, even if but temporarily, from the tyrannical rule of our unconsciousness's need to establish meaning and connections? Another way of putting this is, how do we break free from memory? The act of reading a book is the most powerful and at the same time the most accessible avenue that we have to the means of freeing ourselves from the tyrannical grip of establishing connections, associations, and linkages. Even if it is only temporarily, and even if it is just momentarily, even if it is only for a split second. Becoming literate is therefore detrimental to our salvation. If we can successfully read instruction and execute the instructions flawlessly, we are literate to some degree. There are difficulties in instruction, but all in all, the emphasis is, can we comprehend what is being read enough to carry out instructions, enough to carry out those instructions flawlessly? That would be the point. That would be what it is that we are trying to drive home in this instance. It's what we're aiming to bring along with us in our endeavor to attain what sense of freedom we are seeking, especially that sense of freedom we are seeking from the tyrannical rule of linking. So you read a story, the story grips you so much so that you lose your sense of self in relation to where you currently are placed. Place is not a thing because the power of the grip which seizes you is so strong. Associating where you are isn't relevant or even necessary to establish. Something else is of primordial existence. Something else of primordial existence is much, much more important. The satisfaction we derive from our overloading, the satisfaction that we derive in liberating ourselves from our overloading would-be principles. There is no problem we cannot solve by finding different or varying essences from the perceived problem or problems at hand. We can liberate through transcendence the very problem that is perceived. It's a question of what essence is imagination at work It's a question of what essence is imagination at work when we perceive the expressed about issues we hear about. We can also say it's a question of what essence is imagination working when we express perceived sets of issues. In that soulful, liberating feeling we acquire when we breach through outside of time, which so often comes about through reading, a familiarity with the timeless sense is acquired. We want to develop this sense as much as we possibly can. Bullshit cannot exist there. It fundamentally is opposed to the nature of our being. Freeing ourselves from the overlording rule of our unconsciousness's proclivity for establishing connections in meaning is important. The sense for or familiarity with knowing how to do so is important as well. It's just as equally important. When we begin to break free of our own tyrannical proclivities, the likelihood that others will succeed at putting us under their thumbs, so to speak, becomes obsolete. Mind control and thought control begins first and foremost in our unconscious. Too much of a desire to find meaning and establish relevancy with one thing or another can often does lead us into senses of paranoia. This factor deters us from the phenomena that is on display. Sometimes they're right in front of us. In literature, what becomes literal is the splendor being placed on display by the active imagination. In no way is it concretized or cemented as in some sort of plaque. Instead, it's concretized as always subject to moving in ways and manners that perhaps is new to our being. A little rusty. Oh.